1966. The skies over North Vietnam roar with jet engines. Below, a Soviet-trained surface-to-air missile. Sam, crew, huddles inside a radar command truck, deep in the jungle, scanning for U.S. bombers. Their target, the notorious F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the backbone of American airstrikes. The radar operator's scope flickers, then stabilizes. A contact appears. High altitude. Fast. It's closing in. With calm discipline, the crew swings the SA-2 guideline missile battery into position. Orders are crisp. They've done this before. Track, lock, launch. A white vapor trail cuts across the sky as the first missile streaks upward. But something's wrong. Seconds after launch, their radar screen flashes again, not from the bomber. It's a different signature. Faster. Lower. Closer. The radar warning receiver squeals a high-pitched alert. One of the technicians shouts too late. A shrike-like shadow tears through the canopy. A thunderclap of fire engulfs the radar van. The SAM site isn't the hunter anymore. It's the prey. What struck them wasn't a bomber. It was a wild weasel. A U.S. jet, specifically built to detect, track, and destroy air defense systems by using their own radar signals against them. The idea was almost suicidal. Lure a SAM site into activating its radar, then use that signal to guide a missile right back down its throat. It required insane bravery, cutting-edge electronics, and a level of audacity Soviet commanders had never prepared for. In Moscow, these attacks would soon be dismissed as flukes, impossible to repeat, reliant on sheer luck. But over the next decade, the American Wild Weasel program would evolve into one of the most lethal, precise, and humiliating weapons of the Cold War. Because, in the age of radar, the Americans had discovered the deadliest truth of all. If you could see the enemy, you could kill him first, and nothing sees you faster than your own radar. In the dimly lit war rooms of Moscow, air defense was considered a solved problem. By the early 1960s, Soviet strategists believed the battlefield of the future belonged to radar. The SA-2 guideline missile system, originally designed to shoot down high-altitude intruders like the U-2 spy plane, had become the backbone of an expansive doctrine. The math was simple. Find the enemy with radar, fix them in the beam, and launch. Victory was assumed to be a matter of range and readiness. And with that assumption, a myth was born. That Soviet air defense could not be breached. The SAM network wasn't just hardware, it was a psychological shield. Long-range radar coverage blanketed strategic areas. Short-range systems protected frontline units. Mobile launchers provided flexibility. And all of it was tied into a command architecture that pulsed with electronic confidence. For years, this faith was rewarded. American aircraft, flying at high altitudes, were forced to change tactics. Bombers dipped lower to avoid radar detection. Strikes became riskier. The Pentagon scrambled to design countermeasures, chaff, jammers, evasive maneuvers. Still, pilots were dying. In Vietnam, Soviet advisors embedded with North Vietnamese forces watched with satisfaction as American jets fell from the sky. The SA-2 system seemed unbeatable. And yet, the problem wasn't the kill rate, it was the logic behind it. The Soviet model assumed that radar gave the defender an intrinsic advantage, that activating a fire control radar was a display of strength, not a liability. It was a belief baked into every line of doctrine, every training manual, every simulation. What no one in Moscow had anticipated was that radar itself would become a target, that the electromagnetic signature, once a source of power, could be turned into a beacon for death. American engineers were thinking differently. They weren't trying to avoid the radar. They were trying to weaponize it. The first Wild Weasel crews were flying modified F-100Fs and later F-105Gs, equipped with receivers that could detect even the briefest flicker of a search beam. Once locked in, the aircraft would launch an AGM-45 Shrike, a missile that homed in directly on the source of that signal. The longer the Soviet-trained crews left their radar on, the more certain their destruction became. It was a total inversion of air defense doctrine. In Hanoi, Soviet advisors began to notice a disturbing pattern. The more confident the SAM crews became, the faster they died. Entire batteries would vanish, not from bomb runs, but from being baited, tracked, and annihilated by jets that weren't even targeting the ground at first. In that moment, the assumptions shattered. Soviet command had believed radar made their defenses invulnerable. Instead, it had turned them into lighthouses for precision-guided death. The Soviet theory of air defense was founded on the concept of layered denial, multiple overlapping systems designed to saturate the airspace with threats. Radar was the nervous system. SAMs were the teeth. Interceptors were the claws. No enemy aircraft could survive it, at least in theory. But theory was cracking in the jungles of Southeast Asia. While Soviet advisors clung to their models, American doctrine was undergoing a radical transformation. At a small tactical level, a heretical idea was gaining traction within the U.S. Air Force. Don't run from SAM's sights, hunt them. That idea gave birth to the Wild Weasels. The program began in desperation. American losses to SA-2 seconds were rising sharply, and conventional tactics were failing. So in 1965, the Air Force formed the first Wild Weasel squadrons, flying modified F-100Fs equipped with radar warning receivers and experimental Shrike missiles. The mission was madness on paper. Fly straight into enemy air defense zones, detect radar emissions, identify them mid-flight, and then strike before the enemy struck first. Their motto was brutal in its simplicity. You gotta suppress SAMs or die trying. Over time, the Weasel platform evolved. The F-100 gave way to the F-105G, which offered greater speed and payload. Later still, the F-4C Wild Weasel variant expanded the concept with new sensors, better electronic countermeasures, and a two-man crew. One pilot, one electronic warfare officer EWOs who operated like surgeons inside the electromagnetic spectrum. But this wasn't just a new aircraft, it was a new doctrine. Instead of avoiding air defenses, the Weasels treated them like predators treat wounded prey. They would fly in first, drawing out enemy radar. Once that signal blinked alive, they would trace it, lock on, and fire. Behind them, strike packages could fly with reduced risk, shielded by the chaos the Weasels unleashed. In the beginning, Soviet-trained crews didn't even understand what was happening. Their sights were disappearing before launch. Operators who activated search radars were dying minutes later. The logic of engagement had flipped. Before, turning on your radar gave you power. Now, it marked your grave. This doctrinal rupture wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. The Soviets believed in centralized command, fixed defenses, and electronic dominance. The Americans had just introduced a system built on speed, improvisation, and ambiguity. Even more terrifying, the Weasels weren't trying to destroy infrastructure. They were trying to destroy trust between operator and radar, between signal and survival. Every time a radar blinked on, it invited its own execution. It wasn't just a battle of missiles. It was a war over who could fire first without blinking. And the Americans had built a machine that never blinked. The 22nd of December, 1965, North Vietnam. Captain Jack Donovan and First Lieutenant Harry Brown flew low over the jungle in an F-100F Wild Weasel. The skies were thick with humidity, and enemy radar signals blinked in and out like ghosts. They weren't part of a bombing run. Their mission was simpler, but infinitely more dangerous. Provoke a Soviet-made SA-2 battery into revealing itself, and then destroy it. It was the first Wild Weasel combat sortie in history. At 3,000 feet, the F-100's radar warning receiver flared to life. An S-band emission spike signature of a fan-song fire control radar. Brown shouted confirmation, and Donovan banked the aircraft left, flying directly into the threat zone. This was the impossible moment. In Soviet doctrine, Radar was the kill switch. Once it was activated and a missile launched, there was no counter. The American jet should be dead. But Donovan's Weasel had something the Soviets hadn't accounted for. A passive homing device, locked onto that radar's exact frequency. At the press of a button, Donovan released an AGM-45 Shrike. The missile rode the radar beam like a bloodhound on scent. In less than 30 seconds, it hit the SA-2 guidance truck, while its radar was still tracking the Weasel. It was a clean kill. Soviet advisors at the site were stunned. Their prized system, the very one that had brought down Gary Powers' U-2, had just been silenced without warning. No bomber, no artillery, just a single, fast jet and a missile that had followed their own signal home. This wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a paradigm rupture. Back in Hanoi, North Vietnamese air defense units were placed on immediate alert. Radar silence protocols were introduced, instructing crews to reduce activation times and shift frequencies more frequently. But it was already too late. The Americans had just proven that radar emissions were not just traceable, they were lethal liabilities. In Washington, the Wild Weasel community exploded with energy. Word of the kills spread quickly across squadrons. The impossible had happened. A jet had taken down a SAM site mid-firing sequence before it could inflict a single casualty. The cat-and-mouse game had turned into something darker, a reversal of roles. The predator now had to fear its own roar. Donovan's kill marked more than a successful mission. It marked the end of radar invincibility. No longer could SAM crews feel safe behind electronic walls. From that moment on, every flick of the radar switch was a gamble with death, and it wouldn't be the last. Within months, Wild Weasels would rack up dozens of radar site kills. Soviet technicians scrambled to adapt, but the fear had taken hold. The myth of the untouchable SAM had been broken, and it wasn't bombers or stealth jets that did it. It was a small team of men who flew straight into danger with the sole purpose of triggering the enemy's greatest strength and turning it against them. For the first time in history, radar itself had become a target. In the early months of 1966, telegrams from Hanoi began to pile up on Soviet military desks. The reports were specific, repeated, and deeply troubling. SA-2 sites were being struck with unusual precision not by traditional bomb runs or fighter bombers, but by fast, low-flying American jets that seemed to know exactly when a radar was activated. The term anti-radar missile began appearing in after-action summaries. Soviet advisors described missiles turning mid-air, locking onto emissions, and obliterating radar vans within seconds. At first, the Soviet General Staff refused to believe it. They called the reports hysterical exaggeration from inexperienced personnel under pressure. Soviet engineers in Moscow reviewed the physics and dismissed the concept of a passive homing missile as unfeasible under combat conditions. Tracking radar beams in real time, coordinating flight paths dynamically in a noisy EM spectrum? Fantasy, they said. They assured their Vietnamese allies and themselves that these were coincidences. They blamed American luck, pilot guesswork, conventional bombs that had happened to strike near radar trucks. Anything but what was now clearly unfolding in the jungle. A deliberate, methodical campaign to annihilate radar systems using radar itself. To Soviet leadership, the idea was doctrinally incompatible. The SA-2 was the pride of their layered defense strategy, exported and emulated across Warsaw Pact nations. To admit vulnerability wasn't just military weakness, it was a crack in the foundation of Soviet air superiority. Besides, this would imply the Americans had developed a new class of missile and trained entire squadrons around its use, without the KGB even catching wind. It seemed impossible, but the field reports kept coming. SAM crews began switching off radars when jets approached, fearing a repeat of what was now being called ghost strikes. Entire batteries were retreating into the forests. Emissions dropped, tracking degraded, and still, the weasels hunted. In one particularly damning report, a Soviet advisor described a radar van that was destroyed without any aircraft ever being seen, just a blip of signal, a flash from the trees, and silence. Within weeks, the tone in Moscow shifted from denial to delay. New counter-protocols were issued. Radars were ordered to minimize dwell time. Mobile launchers were told to reposition after every emission. Engineers began investigating signal masking options, even pushing for alternate radar frequencies. But the central truth was unavoidable. Every solution required the radar to function less. And every reduction in radar time made the SAM system less lethal. It was a lose-lose spiral. Either crews risked exposure and death by operating normally, or they hid in the dark, unable to defend the skies. Soviet generals weren't just losing radar trucks. They were losing the very logic of their defense doctrine. For the first time, they were learning what it meant to be outgunned in the electromagnetic spectrum not by jamming, but by precision hunting. And the most terrifying part? The Americans didn't have to destroy every radar. They only had to make them afraid to turn on. Faced with a growing pile of destroyed radar sites and stunned operators, Soviet engineers proposed a new explanation. It wasn't the system that was flawed, it was the crews. The problem, they insisted, was procedural. Radar operators were leaving their emitters on for too long, giving American aircraft enough time to triangulate the signal. The solution seemed straightforward. Reduce dwell time, flick the radar on, acquire the target, then shut it off like a boxer jabbing and retreating. They called it pulse doctrine. To Moscow's military minds, this theory was a lifeline. It preserved the illusion of technological supremacy while placing the blame squarely on human error. Train the crews better, discipline their emissions, and the problem will disappear, they assured each other. But the problem didn't disappear. It got worse. In Vietnam, American Wild Weasel pilots noticed the change almost immediately. The radar signals they hunted were now shorter, faster, more cautious. But the pilots adapted faster. They developed a new tactic called pogoing, rapidly diving and climbing in unpredictable patterns to bait radar operators into activating their systems. It worked. The SAM crews, desperate to get a lock, would break protocol, flicking on their radars just long enough for the weasels to grab a signal. It didn't matter that the beam lasted only 5 seconds. That was all the AGM-45 Shrike needed. And it wasn't just missiles anymore. F-105G Weasels now carried jamming pods and signal analyzers. The aircraft could isolate frequency ranges, identify radar types by pulse pattern, and even simulate radio traffic to confuse operators. Soviet-trained crews weren't just fighting one aircraft, they were fighting an entire electromagnetic ecosystem. The pulse doctrine failed. But Moscow doubled down. Instead of rethinking the foundation, they poured resources into what they called mobile deception. Radar trucks were moved constantly. Fake decoys were set up. Emissions were sometimes broadcast from dummy antennas mounted on wooden frames. It was too little, too late. Weasel crews began logging kill after kill. Operators started refusing to turn on systems until bombs were already falling. Strike pilots reported almost laughable levels of radar silence. The once deadly SA-2 sites became nervous shadows, afraid to blink, terrified to be seen. The most damning part? U.S. crews were now teaching new pilots to treat radar signals as invitations, not threats. This was the inversion that Moscow could not accept. In Soviet doctrine, emitting a radar signal meant dominance. It meant control of the airspace, power over the kill zone. But the Americans had taught their pilots something else, that a radar spike wasn't a warning. It was a target. And the men who chased those spikes, the wild weasels, weren't running from air defenses. They were hunting them, grinning into the fire. By late 1967, after months of escalating radar losses and ineffective countermeasures, Soviet advisors introduced a second theory to explain the wild weasel phenomenon, one rooted in electronic warfare rather than procedural failure. Their conclusion: the American missiles couldn't possibly be as accurate as reported. They must be using decoy signals, electronic noise, or jamming to mask their approach and spoof targeting systems. The Shrike, they argued, wasn't as precise as the reports claimed it was being helped. This became known in internal discussions as the false fix theory. Under this assumption, the radar-guided attacks were not the result of true tracking, but of signal manipulation, advanced American deception, using spoofed emitters and confusing signal overlays to make Soviet crews believe they were safe until it was too late. In theory, this explanation was elegant. It meant that the American strikes could be countered with better filters, frequency hopping, or new encryption layers on radar signals. The problem, according to this view, was electromagnetic clutter, not the vulnerability of the radars themselves. But in reality, the theory fell apart. Because the Shrike wasn't spoofing anything. It was doing exactly what it was built to do: lock onto live radar beams and ride them like a trail of breadcrumbs to their source. Its guidance was brutally simple, and its lethality came not from deception, but from truth. Soviet engineers underestimated this simplicity, because in their world, sophistication equaled complexity. But American engineers had embraced the opposite. They didn't try to outsmart radar. They just made radar out itself. And the more complex the Soviet countermeasures became: frequency agility, fast switching bands, multi-node relays, the easier it became for the Weasel crews to predict operator behavior. Every time a site tried to hide, it left a fingerprint, and every fingerprint led to a kill. Still, Moscow clung to the false fix theory. They instructed crews to randomize their radar pulses. They began work on radar systems that could broadcast on burst transmissions shorter than a missile lock window. These developments would later influence radar families like the P-18 Spoonrest and the 36 D6 Tin Shield. But again, they missed the core problem. The Americans weren't just targeting signals. They were targeting the human habits behind the signals. Where Soviet doctrine expected obedience, American pilots expected improvisation. And the Wild Weasel units adapted in real time, mapping signal bursts, predicting patterns, logging most likely activation windows, and baiting crews into breaking their own safety protocols. In some missions, they didn't even need a radar lock to strike. They knew from repetition where the radar trucks had to be based on terrain, timing, and angle. Then they'd fire preemptively. It wasn't jamming. It was pattern recognition as a weapon. The false fix theory, like the pulse doctrine before it, collapsed under the weight of its own denial. Soviet strategists had convinced themselves the Americans were using illusions, but what they were actually using was clarity. By the end of 1967, Soviet intelligence had accumulated over 100 field reports detailing Wild Weasel activity. Radar trucks were being wiped out within seconds of activation. SAM crews were refusing to fire. Radar sites were left cold, despite incoming U.S. strike packages. The facts were clear, and yet, no comprehensive threat assessment ever reached the General Staff in time to change doctrine. Because Soviet intelligence did something it almost never admitted. It filtered reality through ideology. The KGB, the GRU, and even military liaison officers all received the same pattern of information, yet none could agree on the cause. Some downplayed the threat entirely, blaming Vietnamese incompetence or American luck. Others fixated on technical trivia, range thresholds, altitude bands, radar interference, as if these anomalies explained the systemic collapse unfolding across the SAM network. And all the while, the Americans kept hunting. The biggest blind spot came from an assumption buried deep in the Soviet worldview: that their enemies lacked the initiative, or daring to design a doctrine as suicidal as Wild Weasel operations. No sane military, they believed, would fly straight into SAM kill zones just to fire one missile at a radar truck. But the Americans weren't operating from safety. They were operating from desperation and innovation, born of battlefield necessity. Inside the Pentagon, U.S. intelligence agencies had already begun documenting Soviet radar emissions down to the subband. NSA listening stations captured transmissions. Errant flights mapped radar arcs. Every signal the Soviets used became data to refine new missile seekers and radar warning receivers. The Americans were building a kill chain not from force-on-force combat, but from signals. And the Soviets had no idea how comprehensive it was. In a classified GRU report from early 1968, One senior analyst dismissed Wild Weasel losses as limited tactical events, exaggerated for psychological effect. He cited a lack of large-scale air defense failures, failing to grasp that the entire point of the Wild Weasels was not to destroy air defenses, but to paralyze them through terror and unpredictability. It wasn't about attrition. It was about compliance. If a radar truck refused to turn on, the mission was a success even if no missile was fired. And still, no major redesign of SAM deployment protocols occurred. Soviet crews in Egypt, Syria, and later even Afghanistan would inherit the same flawed doctrine. When faced with Weasel-style tactics, they'd respond with the same wrong tools. More mobility, more camouflage, more denial, but none of that stopped the core problem. You cannot hide from the thing that's already listening. The intelligence failure wasn't just in the field, it was systemic. A refusal to believe the enemy had reinvented the rules. A belief that radar was still a shield, rather than a signature. By the time Soviet engineers began to grasp the scale of what had happened, America had already moved on to smarter missiles, more aggressive doctrines, and fully integrated electronic warfare squadrons. The Wild Weasel wasn't just a program. It was the birth of tactical electromagnetic dominance, and the Soviets had never seen it coming. To understand the revolution America unleashed with the Wild Weasels, one must stop thinking about airplanes and start thinking about systems. By the late 1960s, the United States wasn't just fielding aircraft to destroy radar threats. It was building a complete architecture of suppression, fusing intelligence, technology, training, and doctrine into one mission: to make enemy air defense reactive and terrified. This was the true American system. At its core was SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses. But SEAD wasn't a single tool. It was an orchestra of capabilities, each playing its part in perfect sequence. Start with intelligence. American electronic listening posts dotted the globe. NSA stations in Thailand, Taiwan, Okinawa, and even floating ocean platforms intercepted radar emissions in real time. Every pulse, every frequency modulation, every blink of a fan-song radar was recorded, analyzed, and stored in massive databases. By 1969, some Shrike missiles were being pre-programmed with specific frequency sets before the Weasel even flew its mission. Then came the aircraft. The F-105G became the SEAD workhorse, rugged enough to survive low-level penetrations, fast enough to evade return fire. Equipped with the ANALR-31 radar homing and warning system and multiple Shrike launch rails, the aircraft could detect, analyze, and eliminate radar threats all in one pass. Behind it flew entire strike packages: F-4 Phantoms, B-52 bombers, and tactical bombers like the A-7 Corsair. But these weren't independent actors. They flew according to suppression corridors cleared by Wild Weasels minutes before. The SAM threats had been mapped. Engagement zones were calculated. Radars were either dead or afraid to speak. And this fear was the system's greatest weapon, because American SEAD didn't require total destruction. It required uncertainty. The mere threat of a Weasel jet could neuter an entire air defense sector. Pilots would report radar silence over what were once hot zones. Soviet advisors wrote in frustration about SAM sites going blind the moment an unknown fast mover entered the grid. Electronic warfare aircraft like the EB-66 and later the EF-111 Raven added another layer. They jammed search radars, flooded targeting systems with false returns, and created openings for Weasels to slip through. On the spectrum, it looked like chaos. In reality, it was choreographed dominance. Then there were the people. The Wild Weasel crews were a breed apart. Volunteers for one of the most dangerous missions in aviation, they trained in real-time threat environments, memorizing radar types, kill zone geometries, and missile seeker behavior. The pilot-EWO relationship was sacred, one flying the jet, the other flying the spectrum. In combat, they didn't follow fixed scripts. They improvised, baited, feinted, and attacked based on instinct, training, and machine-read signals. They spoke in code, moved in silence, and operated at speeds most radar systems couldn't track. This system didn't just suppress air defenses, it rewrote the rules of air supremacy. Soviet doctrine had believed in walls, fixed defenses, rigid kill zones, and predictable layers. The Americans brought fluidity, a system where radar was prey, not predator, where signals were invitations, where silence wasn't absence, but fear. And perhaps the most terrifying part for the Soviets? This wasn't the peak. It was only version 1. By the 1,970 seconds, the U.S. was developing next-generation seed weapons like the AGM-88 HARM, training entire squadrons around real-time spectral analysis, and designing aircraft specifically to live inside the radar net and destroy it from within. The Wild Weasels had started as a desperate gamble, but by the end of the Vietnam War, they had become the cutting edge of electromagnetic warfare. They didn't just win missions. They shattered the very idea that radar could ever keep a nation safe again. By 1972, the Americans were no longer content with tactical victories. Operation Linebacker had begun, and with it came the most brutal, sustained campaign of radar annihilation the world had ever seen. Hanoi became a crucible, and Soviet advisors watched as their once proud SAM network was reduced to a paranoid, blinking ruin. This was the humiliation battle. On paper, North Vietnam's air defense was one of the densest in history. Over 400 SA, 2 launchers, dozens of radar types, a spiderweb of AAA zones. Soviet planners believed it was impenetrable. A fortress of radiation and steel. Then came the Weasels, flying F-105GS, and soon after, the faster F-4GS. They poured into the kill zones first, not last. First. Their mission: light up the fan-song radars, bait them into switching on, and fire shrikes before they could blink. It was combat chess played at Mach 1, and the Americans were always one move ahead. One after another, radar vans lit up and exploded. In a single 72-hour window during Linebacker 2, over 30 SAM sites were neutralized. Some were destroyed, others simply never fired. The operators were too afraid. Vietnamese crews refused to activate their radars, even during bombing runs. Soviet advisors begged them to engage, but the silence persisted. The skies weren't dark from weather. They were dark from fear. In one infamous moment, a Weasel crew baited 3 separate SAM sites into opening fire, only to dodge all 3 missiles and return fire within seconds. 2 radar sites were obliterated. The third was abandoned. Soviet officers wrote back to Moscow in disbelief. "Our missiles are not blind. Our crews are not cowards, but they are fighting ghosts." The Americans weren't ghosts. They were tacticians. They mapped terrain, timed radar pulses, and used deception maneuvers to make radar crews fire prematurely, wasting precious missiles. In many cases, Weasels fired without radar locks, predicting the location of radar vans from previous patterns. It worked. By the time B-52 bombers flew their arcs, the sky had already been cleared. The ultimate embarrassment came when the Soviets realized that entire SAM sectors were refusing to engage. Despite full ammo and functioning systems, their operators would rather go dark than risk retaliation. Wild Weasel pilots began joking that they had achieved suppression by reputation. This wasn't warfare. It was psychological domination. Moscow finally acknowledged the depth of the failure. Emergency cables urged Soviet engineers to deploy mobile radars faster, rotate frequencies, and accelerate the development of passive detection systems. But none of these efforts would arrive in time. Because the battle wasn't just about technology. It was about tempo, doctrine, and courage. American Weasel crews turned fear into a weapon. They wrote, "YGBSM, you gotta be shittin' me" on their dashboards, a tribute to the first pilot who heard the mission profile and thought it was suicidal. It wasn't. It was war's most elegant inversion, a mission that asked its pilots to do the unthinkable. fly toward the threat, trigger the trap, and kill it mid-snap. No Soviet strategist had ever prepared for that. The humiliation wasn't in the loss of radar vans. It was in the loss of certainty. The slow, creeping realization that a doctrine built on electronic control had become a blinking beacon for its own destruction. The Americans hadn't just fought radar. They'd redefined what radar meant. What began as a battlefield innovation in Southeast Asia soon echoed across every Soviet command post from Minsk to Vladivostok. The Wild Weasels hadn't just embarrassed SAM crews, they had detonated a silent crisis at the core of Soviet strategic thinking. For decades, the USSR had invested billions into layered air defense. Radar was sacred. Control through signals was the beating heart of their ideology. Unlike the United States, which prioritized offensive air power and carrier-based flexibility, Soviet planners believed the skies could be locked down, gridded, tracked, and denied. But now, a small group of American pilots had disproved that idea with violent clarity. The strategic failure wasn't just in Vietnam. It was in the realization that every Soviet-aligned state, Poland, East Germany, Cuba, even the Soviet Far East, was built on a system that assumed radar control was permanent. And if radar could be hunted, if the very act of emitting made you a target, then the entire Soviet air defense strategy was obsolete before a war even began. In closed-door meetings, Soviet air marshals began using words once unthinkable: asymmetry, vulnerability, exposure. KGB liaisons to the VVS reported deep concern among younger officers, many of whom quietly admired the Americans' aggression. Some even admitted that, had they flown against weasels, they'd have kept their radars off too. It was a collapse not just of tactics but of pride. The SA-2 had once downed Gary Powers' U-2. It had been paraded through Red Square as the symbol of technological parity. Now it was a tombstone waiting to be lit up by a laughing F-4 crew flying below the tree line. Soviet engineers scrambled to respond. New mobile systems were accelerated. Passive detection arrays were proposed. But every fix led to a concession: less radar time, lower emission strength, shorter range. And that meant one thing: less control. From Cuba to Afghanistan, from Angola to Syria, Soviet allies began reporting similar problems: SAMs that wouldn't fire, radars that refused to illuminate, operators that blinked, and behind each hesitation was the ghost of a Shrike, humming through the sky at Mach 2, following the whisper of a signal. What hurt most was that the Soviets had no answer. Not technologically, not doctrinally, not ideologically. To change their system would mean admitting that the Americans had not only out-engineered them but out-thought them. That radar was no longer a shield. That control through emission had become death by detection. And in a system built on control, that was collapse. Decades after the last F-105G returned from Southeast Asia, the ghost of the Wild Weasel still haunts every military radar operator trained in the former Soviet bloc. In Ukraine, in Syria, in modern conflicts where Russian-designed systems still rule the ground, the same dilemma returns like a curse: to see or to survive. That is the legacy the Wild Weasels left behind. In museums, the Shrike missile sits quietly eclipsed by newer weapons like the AGM-88 HARM and satellite-guided precision bombs. But its legacy is deeper than steel and circuitry. It reshaped air warfare. It turned electronic emissions into vulnerabilities. And it taught every nation from NATO to the Warsaw Pact that control of the air doesn't begin with the biggest radar dish. It begins with fear. Modern Russian systems have improved shorter activation windows, passive sensors, signal triangulation. But the core vulnerability remains. Every time a radar beam is activated, a signature is born. And the more confident the operator, the more predictable the signal. Wild Weasel squadrons still fly today, now equipped with digital sensors, real-time battlefield links, and advanced missiles. They train on doctrine born over Hanoi in 1965. They still use the same call sign: still wear the YGBSM motto, still chase enemy radars into silence. Because the Cold War never ended for the men who hunt signals. And for the Soviet command system that once believed it could see all, the Weasels proved one final, brutal truth. You can't control the sky if the sky knows your name.